It's better for you to have a culture, values, principles, open communication set up in a way where if somebody's not going to be a good fit in the future, they take it upon themselves and be like, I'm not a good fit, and I get it. What is going on, Summit Chasers? Welcome to another week in review with the Summit crew. I'm very excited to be here with my ladies, my team. We're going to go through our week in review, some of the wins that we've had from the week, some of our takeaways, some of the things that we learned. We'll say this every week, but one of our core values that we believe in the most is to grow or die. That means we are always trying to learn. We're always trying to take something in. Even if it's unintentional, if we find an opportunity to learn, we're going to take it. And we want to hold each other accountable. We want you to hold us accountable to always learn, just like we could hold you accountable to always learn and move forward in your life and your business. So we're going to work on that first. And then later on, Chrissy is going to highlight a small business of the week like we do every week. So we're really excited about that. And then we are going to get a little bit deeper into our selecting hiring process, part of our Summit Chasers Increasing Your Talent Density framework. So we're going to go kind of into the best practices for interviewing and the selecting process there. Last week, we went over how do you define the right person for the role, and then where can you find them? And if you haven't watched that one yet from last week, go back and watch it. Adrina's a big fan of the thumbnail on YouTube, so go find that one from last week and touch up on kind of that initial process in bringing in a key player that could make your life easier and grow your business. So let's get into it. I'm always going to pick on Chrissy first. Chrissy, what were some wins and takeaways from the week from you?
Well, a big win is that we are babysitting our niece and nephew, who are 4 and 2 this week. They are the artists behind the artwork on my shelf over here. We have made it to day 3, so that is a big win for the week. One of my takeaways this week was that I think we talked about internal communication in the past, and I actually was just thinking about the way that information trickles throughout the organization and how long sometimes it takes to go between layers. And so as executives are thinking about things or discussing things, and then they start sharing it out to their direct reports and their leadership teams, and we really want to think about how quickly that information disseminates throughout the organization. Situation came across my, one of the conversations I was having this week with someone outside of my organization, but they were saying just about how slowly information is making its way from the executive team down to some of the frontline employees. And I think a lot of that actually can get solved through org design. Like, do you have too many layers within the organization? Or, are managers and leaders really capable of taking that messaging and articulating it and contextualizing it in a way that makes sense? But we shouldn't take for granted how long it takes for some of that messaging to start resonating and absorbing throughout the conversation and throughout the organization. And I think a good reminder for me is that by the time the employees within the organization start to understand that executive messaging, the executives are always on to like the next phase of the business. And so I was really thinking a lot about like, what does that lead time look like, right, throughout organizations? And is there a best practice? I don't know. Like something's kind of been like weighing on my mind of how should we think about benchmarks around like what's the right amount of time to ensure that your messaging is effectively making its way throughout the organization, so employees are not 2 or 3 quarters behind what the executive team is already working on and switching gears to start focusing on. So that's kind of like a grow or die moment for me of like, how do I start thinking about what some of the communication benchmarks are that we should be framing up for the Summit Chasers network, or getting advice from the group here, what works well, and what are some of the internal benchmarks that people are using.
What do they use to define like the communication sources that they use for each communication itself? Like, this can be an email, this needs to be a direct communication from the CEO or whatever, the director, VP, and then what can be kind of a trickle down from each layer, like you said, of management? Do they have a definition of like, okay, this needs to be this needs to go through this?
Well, I think it's all different, right? Like sometimes you don't want things documented everywhere because it's really confidential information. And that's really something that you need to spend a lot of time in front of groups where you're doing word of mouth, you're verbally, delivering the messaging because you don't want, this proprietary or confidential information to be plastered all over these written, channels. But I would love Audrina as her operations background. I think everything really depends on the culture of the organization and how the companies communicate. Sometimes it is in Slack, sometimes it is over email. But I took a course on like a Harvard Business School online class, and one of the CEOs that they had in one of the like use cases or case studies was really talking about no matter what the channel, the key to successful communications is over communicating. Like, don't feel like you can't say it often enough if it's something that you need everyone to know. And so, Audrina, I'd actually love to hear how you think about this.
Yeah, I do think that over communication is absolutely key. I also think that if it's a message that is coming from the very, very top level, it is so important for your leaders to clearly understand that message and be able to communicate it very, very well to their teams. Because yes, they're going to hear it from the top level once, that's great, but that doesn't always mean that they're going to be able to fully understand or comprehend or just, I guess, understand all the things that go into communicating those big things. So I think it's really important that the leaders understand how to continue to speak to their teams about it. And a lot of times when leaders are helping to communicate those things, it's really important that the exec level team is able to almost coach and just help leaders be able to answer the different questions that might come out of it or concerns that might come out of it and how to handle concerns and send them to HR when they need to or handle it within themselves or within their own team. But yeah, I think over communication is key. Having every level, the higher you go, have a very good understanding of it and the ability to break it down further to their teams and then troubleshoot. Because often when I think of like those big communications, they're usually things that are shaking up the organization or it's a new innovation that you guys are wanting to get into or they can have like a pretty big impact on some of the lower levels within the organization. So yeah, being able to prep your leadership team to be able to handle anything, any concerns that come up, even if it's excitement, just like, oh my gosh, what does this mean for me? Where am I going? For them to be able to explain those things very, very clearly to their team, I think is key. And then there is a time and a place for written emails versus Slack versus Zoom if you're remote or in person. And I think that just comes down to the way that your org is set up. It's kind of hard to say like this is best practice for everything. But then there's also the addition of if you make a huge announcement, being able to communicate it via email in some situations too, so that it's written to people that maybe process a little bit better by reading things themselves, can see it and have another way to digest the information.
Good. Anything else to add to that?
No.
Beautiful. I love it. All right, Audrina, what were some wins and takeaways from the week?
Some wins and takeaways from the week. We had a really good week. We had really great client meetings, and it's been really fun to see things just progressing with all of our clients and things really starting to take shape in their business, and they're realizing the potential that they've had that they didn't realize before because of the exercises that we're doing. So that has been really, really cool to see. For myself, I think that my grow or die would be the importance of getting out of your comfort zone and just the growth that comes from that in general. And I think that can come from so many different things, whether it's in your personal life, your business, or whatever. Just push yourself to feel uncomfortable and to see the growth that will happen from it.
What's the last thing that, Christy, the last thing you did that you were like really made you, like you had to get outside your comfort zone? Like you went into something, it's like you jumped into the ocean, you don't see the bottom. Adrena, you got to smack your mic again. You need to stop hitting it. Yeah, don't.
It was Cage.
Okay, go ahead.
It was Cage. Sorry.
I don't know. I mean, actually, I think the last time I did something that was really out of my comfort zone is when I actually started practicing like trading stocks. We had some equity that I had gotten some equity from Snap, and it was during COVID. We weren't, we were stuck at home, and I was like, let's just kind of take a little bit of money and test out stock picks. Like, I actually decided to just do some lifestyle, brands. Okay, Delta. I only fly Delta. So I was like, I'm going to buy Delta stock, because if I don't buy the stocks of the companies that I'm using all the time, there's got to be a million me's out there, right? So, those kind of felt safe to me. But that was really scary, because I'm like, how do I trust myself on this stuff, right? Or how do people do this? It must be like super complicated. Like, you definitely need to pay attention. But I think that was one of the first things that really let me practice. Like, I don't gamble, but it felt a little bit like gambling. So that felt like the first thing. But once I started doing that, I actually started to think about using money to make more money. And so it was a different mindset and a different relationship for me on how I want to, how do I want to build my, future out. And that's really what got me into investing into companies. And so I was like, okay, if I'm going to invest in a company through equity shares, it's the same thing as, when I'm starting to meet these founders and executives or, entrepreneurs who want to start businesses. And I'm like, yeah, I can put some money in and see how this goes. Like, I'm more comfortable with the concept of you don't control the future, but you invest in the things that you believe in and you care about. And there's other people like you in the marketplace who are going to find this just as valuable. And so I think for me, that was one thing that like really took me out of my comfort zone, but it totally shifted my entire perspective on pretty much everything. So that, I think that's the last time. And that was in 2020, probably like June of 2020.
Yeah, it's cool how you can start to do, or you do something like that where you're really uncomfortable with it. Like, you just don't know. Like, again, you jumped into an ocean and you don't see the bottom, or a pool, you don't see the bottom. Ocean's a little bit scarier. But the other skills that you can develop because of taking those chances, or because of doing the unknown, like, you develop other skills. Like, it's not just the thing. Like, you didn't just learn how to trade stocks, like what buttons to press and how to forecast and that kind of stuff. It changed your perspective on how you see money. So that's a great example of that. That's really, really cool. Really, really cool. Adrena, did you have any other takeaways while you were dealing with our coworkers? You're on mute.
Because I have a barking dog. No, I don't have any other takeaways currently. Gotcha.
Well, that's our coworker, Cage. He's our security guard. He makes sure that nobody's, I don't know what he makes sure that he makes sure no cats get on the front yard. But he's good at it. He's really good at what he does.
There's a cat right outside the window.
Well, I'm not a cat person innately, so that's fine. It's probably a wild cat. It's fine. We had bird feeders out back. He's just protecting the birds. But for me, my kind of a winner takeaway from the week, I mean, it kind of maybe would be an extension of yours, Adrena, obviously, because we work so closely together, but is seeing our clients go through something that maybe on paper seems uncomfortable or like a setback, when really it's a win. And it's uncomfortable when you're in like a consultative role, or like a fractional role, kind of how we operate. We're more of a partnership, right? And when something uncomfortable, like somebody leaving, like a previous key employee leaves, but you just have to be like reminded that that's part of the process. That's part of this, like the molting process almost, of like a company and team molding into what they need to be in order to be successful, especially long term. We had a client who had somebody who left, who quit, but he wasn't a good cultural fit. He was a very nice guy, a very nice individual. There's nothing, he didn't do anything wrong. He just wasn't a great fit. And again, initially, that's as us, it's kind of like, oops, like you innately immediately have like, oh crap, did we do something? But then you go back and you take inventory of kind of the process leading up to it. It's okay. This is just part of the process, right? And like we've been there before, whether it's in our own businesses or even with some clients I've had in the past. But when it was just a little bit closer, a little bit closer to the source, I guess, for us. But it's again, to see us be able to coach and shift the business owner to like, okay, no, this is actually a good thing, and here's the plan and strategy we can use to get out of it, or to take the positive away from it and move forward. It's better that it happened now than in 6 months from now. And that's one thing with, it's better for you to have a culture, values, principles, open communication set up in a way where if somebody's not going to be a good fit in the future, they take it upon themselves and be like, I'm not a good fit. And I get it. I get it. So I'm going to go find something else. I'm going to stick with you for a month or so we can get somebody else in. I appreciate everything, but I'm going to move on. Like, and then that's exactly what happened. And that's best case scenario, as opposed to it just lingering on for another 6 months or a year, or sometimes even longer than that in some cases. And then they leave, but you've had 6 months or a year or 2 years of resentment building up because they weren't a good fit. They're not fitting. They're not, I don't want to say they're not fitting in. This isn't high school, but they're just not getting out of it what they want. Right. So that they're just not being honest. And then we know how our brains work. When things aren't out in the open, we don't know the full story. We create our own stories. And a lot of times it's like worse than worst case scenario. So it's good that it happened when it did. And we're moving forward really positively. And it was a good thing for both sides. So that was a pretty cool takeaway and situation to have to kind of process and deal with the client. So yeah, that was good. It was a win. That was a big win and a cool takeaway for us.
Zach, I want to just say, in those moments, that is courage on all sides, because it is really courageous, I think, to say, you know what, this company is not the right fit for me. And it's really, I think, courageous for a company to say, this is not going to work out, but we are here to help you find your next opportunity. And how do we make sure that everything is, everyone is leaving in a good place? Because as the employee, it's much easier to stay somewhere that right? Even if you're not really thriving or you don't love it there, I think that's a sense of security in some case. And you were just talking about jumping into a pool. I remember the first time I left my first job, like when I left K-Force after 7 years to go to Russell Tobin, I was like really nervous. I was like, how do people leave their job? This is so overwhelming. And I knew it was the right place. I knew it was the right time and the right place for me, but it was so overwhelming. And I had to trust that I wasn't going to lose this next job in the next 5 weeks. You know what I mean? Like something like, oh my God, am I going to be able to pay my rent? Like, I am on my own and I need to find a way to make sure that I can, survive and support myself and everything. And so then you kind of like, so that was a first big, jump into a bottomless ocean. But what I think it's like moving and changing jobs, and I don't know, like something else are like the 3 most traumatic, it might be like death, moving, and changing jobs are the 3 most traumatic experiences in life. And I actually think that we should probably do a whole episode on that, of like, giving that much respect to this moment of transition for people, like whether you're the employer and you have to make a really, really tough call about someone on your team, or you're an employee or a leader within an organization, and either the organization's values have shifted or they're going to a different phase and it's not the right phase for you anymore, or you are like, you know what, this just isn't the right environment for me, and I've changed as a person since joining, and this just is no longer serving me. And Yeah, that's a great moment to bring up because that's a huge moment of transition for people.
Yeah. And it's kind of glorified. It's unfortunate because it's glorified. There's the saying of people will make a change when the pain of staying the same exceeds the power of making the change. It doesn't have to be that way, right? Like you don't have to stay in this role or job or business. Yeah, I can probably hear it through my mic too. There's Cage, he's on patrol. You don't have to stay until the pain is just unbearable and you despise everybody that you're around. You don't like the company anymore. You're more likely to leave on bad terms. Therefore, then you're setting up your next venture or your next goal on poorly, right? You're not going to probably have as much help. You're going to burn some bridges. You've lost part of your network, right? It's tough. So if you can identify that beforehand, you're right. That's very brave. Is making the decision when it's not obvious. It's making the decision when it feels right, right? When it's just clearly the right decision. But yeah, I think we could definitely do a whole episode on that. Me and Adrina actually have an announcement that we're not going to announce here. Of speaking of being brave, so we'll do that in a bit here.
Tease it at the beginning with my whole grow or die, but I was like, I don't know if I'm allowed to right now, so I kept my mouth shut. So Chrissy, we're gonna leave you hanging too. We'll fill you in though. Zach, the dogs are on one this morning. I don't know what is going on outside, but Cage is just on high alert.
They're doing their job. That's literally why we got him, to look after the house.
Yeah.
So it's fine. It is fine. All right. Moving forward. So last week, this is actually going to be a pretty good segue because it's kind of the other side of that. Yeah. Now you've found somebody who left a job, did the brave thing. Hopefully they're on good terms so you can get good, accurate references. But we've identified them. We know where to find them. Right? We've got them booked for an initial interview, whether it's through a what's it called? A agent? I'm not agent. She's a recruiter. That's what I'm talking about. Whether it's through a recruiter or your own internal process. But where do you start? Very first interview. Let's say they didn't go through a recruiter. We'll do it kind of in two. They go through a recruiter or they don't go through a recruiter. Let's say you're a small business owner. You feel like you've found a couple good candidates. You're about to do an initial interview with them. Very first time you're talking to them. What does that look like?
Adrina, I'll let you start.
Okay, no problem. Sounds
quiet over there for a minute.
Yeah. So I think initially, and when you're going into the very first interview, it is so important, in my opinion, to look for a culture fit, somebody who is going to be excited and bought into your mission and what you're trying to achieve. And then just getting a baseline understanding of if they have the right skill sets that you need, the right characteristics. But this is not the time to go way in depth on really understanding if they're the right person for the job. This is basically like just your initial screening interview, getting a good feel for the candidate. I think it shouldn't really be more than 30 minutes when you're going into this initial one. Again, just baseline, get a good understanding. Zach, you're going to kill me, but is there a good vibe between you and the candidate? And then do they have the baseline like skills characteristics that you need for the position? And then if they pass that, then we can talk about second round later. But I think just have that initial 30-minute screening call, get a good feel for it, nice, good, and go from there.
Can't be mad at this thing. Like it's fine. Yeah, I think like that initial one, like one thing that a lot of probably most businesses do poorly on the initial, we call it like the screening interview, is that it's different every time. And it should be different for each role, right? If you're hiring for roles, like different roles, the questions will be a little bit different. The process will be a little bit different. But you want it to be consistent, because if it's different, you don't know when it messes up, you don't know what to change. You don't know what went wrong. You don't know what to adjust. You don't know there's no data points there at that point. So that initial interview, I'm a big fan of keeping it very similar, keeping it the same every time pretty well, like asking the same type of questions, even having the same people doing the interviews. And then you can see, okay, these are slipping through and they shouldn't. Okay, why? What can we adjust? Or we feel like we're missing some people who could have been really good candidates. Why are they not getting through? And then you have to actually have data points, consistent data points, and you have something to adjust. So I think that's probably, like, in the initial screening interview, one of the bigger probably mistakes I see is just they make it so different every time, and somebody different's doing the interview every time, and it's completely different. Sometimes they're taking them out for lunch, sometimes they're having a 5-minute phone call, sometimes they're on Zoom for an hour and a half. It should be short, to the point, verify of what's on their resume, verify they understand what job that they're applying for, and get a little bit of a feel that what's on their resume is accurate and they can speak to it, and that they can hold a conversation, or whatever cultural tests you want to put them through. But for me, as long as they're personable, they can hold a conversation. And again, it depends on the company, but there's some companies who are a little bit more, like you say, like rough under the hood. They need to be able to take a joke and kind of laugh and have a little bit of banter. And then there's some that are a little bit more white glove. Then they need to be more well spoken, eye contact, all that kind of good stuff. So as long as it's consistent. That'd be my biggest thing, probably, with the screening interview, which is as long as it's consistent, so you can get consistent data. Well, Chrissy, the master of this, let's hear from her.
Can I?
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, go.
I think that is such a good point about making it consistent and repeatable. I think that somewhere where I've seen a lot of business owners go wrong, or even just leadership teams, is not providing your hiring team, whether you're going to pass it to the manager on the team or whoever's doing that initial interview. One of the biggest mistakes I see is that they don't actually pass them any sort of framework or tool to work off of when interviewing. And it's kind of like Zach said, it's a free-for-all. You have some people doing it this way, then you've got some people taking them out to lunch, or you've got some people doing a call or a Zoom or whatever it might be. There's no consistency, and I think you're doing yourself and your leaders a disservice if you don't provide them with some sort of framework to have that initial interview and every interview after that. Interviewing, I think, is something that is so vital and so crucial to making sure that you're bringing in the right people into your org, that to not set your hiring team or manager or leader up for success is just, it's unfair. It's unfair to them. It's unfair to you and your business. You're going to end up potentially bringing the wrong people in because you don't have a process in place to make sure that you're weeding out those people. So creating those frameworks, working with us, we'll get you the frameworks, and just being able to have a structure for interviewing is huge.
Yeah, we call those interview plans. I mean, it's like very simple and straightforward, but I think it's like just going into the interview with a plan. Do you have a plan set of questions that you guys have really practiced in and really honed what it is that you're looking for in terms of the response out of those questions, right? And so I think one thing is making sure that everyone who's on the interview panel or will be interviewing candidates are aligned on what the outcomes, what ideal outcomes look or sound like, or just directionally, from candidates. So that's one, so the frameworks, things like you were saying. The other is also, what's the quality of your interviewers on the panel? So do you have your best performers vetting the candidates coming into your organization, or do you have managers who are maybe not driving the right results around the organization, selecting talent to come into the org? Like it's okay if you do, because you will need to, this might be part of their coaching and development, but you should make sure that you have the right quality of individuals who are holding a bar, of what good looks like as they come into the organization. Zach, I think we talked about this on a previous one, but I'm not sure if we actually recorded it or not. But I think that, this is the hardest, interviewing is the hardest thing, because sometimes you hire one person, or sometimes you hire 10 people a year, and those 10 people might be on 10 different teams, and those managers aren't getting, the frequency or the cycles that they need to be able to really start, getting some pattern recognition around what does good look like, or how do I know if this candidate is kind of like heading into the right direction around some of the concepts that we're trying to cover, or how do I naturally ask, 5 follow-up questions to help guide the candidate towards the outcome that I'm hoping they can get to? And a lot of that takes practice and repetition. And so, um, that's another thing too. If you are working with a recruiter, the value of having a recruiter is they are interviewing hundreds of candidates, a month for tens of jobs with like tens of different companies and tens of different hiring managers who are all looking for different things. And they can start really building kind of like what's the best practice that they want to take away from each of their, you know, 10 to 50 to 100 different clients to put together what a really awesome interviews can like questionnaire or profile looks like, or an interview plan. And so if you are working with recruiters or you have recruiters in your network, ask them, hey, what are some of the things that my competitors look for when they're hiring for these types of profiles? And, use the knowledge of what they've been able to crowdsource, from other hiring managers. And that's really the power of networking and community. And, I think we'll be able to start building. I mean, how awesome would it be to kind of crowdsource an awesome interview plan from all of the business leaders and Summit Chasers to say, what are your favorite interview questions? What are your most, like, what do you get the most out of those conversations with people? Or, I think the days of you're traveling to a moon and you can only bring 6 things, and what are you going to bring? Like, those like crazy, like Google type of interview questions, those are insane. And I don't really think they have a real place in the world, but like, to each their own. But I think there's a lot of really good, deep interview questions that people ask, to find real human beings to come work in their organizations. And you don't learn those questions without speaking to a ton of different people, over and over and over. So I think that's just like another thing is like have a plan, make sure you have the right people on the interview panel who are going to hold a good bar, and where you can get repetition and like learn, from a community, or, get in your repetition cycles. That's what is really key.
Yeah. Well, and to your like a previous point that you were making, if you're only hiring one person a year, and some small businesses, especially, a couple of our clients haven't hired somebody in a couple of years, right? So they don't necessarily have the experience. They don't have the reps underneath, like the repetition in the practice. But what they can do, and if you're in a similar position, you're listening to this, or you're just not hiring very often, or don't feel it's important to have a process, is the people that you have key players, you have A players on your team right now. Always pay attention to what makes them so, right? What type of things make them tick? What type of habits do they have? What type of conversations do they hold? You can use them as good case studies to determine who could possibly be a better fit for your role. But you want to be careful because you don't want to hire a bunch of the same people, but you can get a good idea of what makes them competent, what makes them successful in their role. And it could be just the way they break down problems. It could be the way they communicate. It could be the way they invest into themselves, right? Like that's somebody that we need on the team, somebody who invests in themselves, somebody who's willing to have harder conversations, and that like you can take that and then you can understand those data points and then create kind of okay, I can probably ask these kind of questions. I can cater, I can kind of push them this way to see if I can determine that or not. Like you can still kind of get at least a framework of what you want if you're not doing it very often. But that's just for like the screening interview. So again, that first step, just to kind of reel us in, it should be fairly short, but it should be to the point, and it should be consistent. You should have somebody you trust doing them. Like you should have a solid, and whether it's more than one person that's doing them, they should always be communicating if that's the case. But it should be consistent. You should have people that you trust doing it. If it's not yourself, ideally it's not yourself doing the initial screening interviews because you're doing more of them. But have the process. And again, having a process is better than having no process. Having a process that needs work is better than having none, right? Because at least then you have something consistent that you can build upon. But you've had this screening interview. you think this person could possibly be a good fit, or you got information from a recruiter. And we kind of talked about this last week. I'll briefly touch on it now just to get everybody up to date. But if you're working with a recruiter, ideally, this is a green flag, or if they don't do it, it's a big red flag. Ideally, the recruiter should be sending you a breakdown of how their initial screening interview went with them. This is why I think they're going to be a good fit. And they know that based on them doing an in-depth discovery with you on what you're looking for, your company, your culture, etc. So they should be sending you that breakdown. This is why I think they're going to be a good fit. This is their experience. This is what they're expecting, so on and so forth, right? So you have that information, whether it's from your own internal screening interview or a recruiter initial screening interview. And then you move on to, what's the next one? Everybody remember what the next one is?
The top grading interview.
That was a top grade. I was going to sign with them. My hand didn't get in the camera. Top grading interview. This one's fun. It's fun. This one's fun. This is a little bit of a longer interview. And this is where it would be good to have a panel, like more than one person interviewing at a time, just because there is so much information, and one might iterate something that they say a little bit different than the other one. You can challenge from different angles, so to speak. But this is where you really go in depth, really in their last 10 years of work history. If they've only worked in one place for the last 10 years, then you can go back a little bit further than that, but usually not much more than 10 years, because they're just a different person at that point. But their last 10 years of work history, that might be one place, might be two, might be five. If it's five, that's usually a red flag in itself, unless they're working as a consultant or fractional. And you really dive into each of their roles. And this is the last thing I'm going to say, that I'm going to pass it on. One thing that I really try to focus on in this top grading interview is the things that they perceived as accomplishments or wins in that role. Did they align with did it align with the reason that they were hired in the first place? So if they're hired for sales, and they're hired for, if they're like an AE, they're meant to have deeper, stronger, more lucrative relationships with current clients. But their most proud thing is that they went and they built a whole bunch of other accounts, which is great. I just one thing that I like to know from here is the reason that you're hired. Do you stay? Like, is that your mission at that point? So if I hire you to achieve X, are you going to achieve X, or you're going to go for Z type of thing, right? So, and sometimes that can be hidden as a good thing, and a lot of times it could be a good thing, especially if it's with a small business they're trying to grow. In that case, it's good to go and get more business. But there's other case studies that we could probably throw out there where that would be a negative. But that's one of the big things I try to find, is making sure that the reason they're hired in those other places is consistent with some of the accomplishments that they're most proud of. That's one of my favorite things. But anyways, I'll pass it off to somebody else.
I think another key part, we'll go. Another key part of this one is where you really dive into their strengths and weaknesses, and really get a good understanding of what they will bring to your company. I think this is where you also want to tie into what we've spoken about in the past, which is that thought diversity, the importance of hiring for the things that you're lacking within your team. So it's you obviously want a team of A players, but you want a team that brings in different strengths. Like, everybody's got their own strengths, and it's going to add to this absolute kick-ass killer team. Like we talked about last week, looking at your company as a top sports team rather than a family dynamic. And in a sports team, everybody has their role. And if we want to stick with football, I can see if I can still remember, but you've got like your wide receivers, they've got their job, the running backs, the fullbacks, the quarterback, your defensive line. All of those players have their own key strengths that make them absolute killers in those roles. So same thing goes when you're bringing in these new hires. So when you're in this second round of interviews, you really want to make sure that you're bringing in that thought diversity, or you're bringing in a strength that you're currently lacking within your team. Maybe it's innovation or creativity. So looking for those characteristics that you can add to your team that will allow your company to level up as a whole is going to be another really big part of this second interview.
When I was looking through the top grading interview framework, I loved that Zach was bringing up the question of, like, did their achievements actually align to the job that they were hired to do? And I was like, wow, that is so interesting. Like, you obviously know that's something you should be looking for, But I think a lot of people go in with the assumption that they have stayed really focused on the work that they were brought in to do. And it's really interesting. It's a really interesting question, kind of, provocative to ask the candidate that, because um that talks a lot about like organizational alignment. Like, number one, was that person set up, were they given the goals and frameworks, and did the leadership team kind of like build the organization to keep them on task? Or was it the dynamic of the organization where the person can kind of come in, and a lot of companies say, oh, this role is going to be what you make of it. And that is kind of lawless. Like, like that's a lot of responsibility to put on the employee to hope that they understand how to build the job to deliver to your organization what you hope that they're going to do, right? And so I think we were talking about this when you're like, how do we define job descriptions and things of that nature? Yeah, like I loved that question, because there's just this assumption that like when I come in to do the thing, I'm going to understand it the way this company is asking me to, or intends for me to understand what the work looks like. And there's two things, and this kind of goes back to like, when do you decide if it's the right time to leave an organization? Is you know are you able to succeed? Does the company set you up with the right infrastructure to be able to deliver on the job that they brought you in to do? And in some cases, you will need an entrepreneurial mind, even as an employee within an organization, because in a year, the organizational framework, you might exceed what the organizational framework has in place, because you've done the job that they brought you in to do the way that it was set up that day. And your work is to evolve the company to continue to grow the infrastructure around what the function of the work is that you're doing, right? Like, so you might want to make sure that this person shows some, career expansion, increased in complexity in the work that they were doing. Are the accounts they were building, did they start from, 10K to 100K? Did they move on to be managing multi-million dollar accounts over time? You want to make sure that you see that person is growing in line, right, with the organization. And in some cases, people may grow ahead of the organization, which is why they're ready to move on to their next career opportunity. But it's also kind of good to know a little bit of like, where's this organization? What growth trajectory has this organization been on? Because if you think that the way that they're talking about their accomplishments in their last role sounds like they're lagging behind the growth of the organization, that's a good indicator too of, is this person going to be able to keep up in the dynamic of your business, right? Are they going to be able to grow multi-year with your company? And depending on the scope of the role, it might be okay if they can just do the work for 12 months, or you don't need them to keep pace with the organization. But in other roles or different levels of strategy within the org, you're like, all right, I need someone who can kind of like disrupt themselves or outgrow their job every 12 to 18 months and build the next opportunity within my company for them, to develop the new skills. So yeah, anyway, not to go off on a total tangent, but that one question like sparked this whole thread for me. And I just really loved that you articulated it that way.
Well, I appreciate that. But I mean, you made a couple really good points right there as well. Like, and it can go both ways. So to your point, if there's somebody who in that role, they came in and they were like, yeah, I got hired, and then they were just like, yeah, take it, make it what you want, right? When you're hiring for a very creative role that requires somebody to kind of be able to be on their own, to create, to push the envelope in certain areas, then that would be a green flag, more so a green flag in that point. But if you're hiring for somebody to be more, we have a process, we have a system, we just need you to work within it so that we can make small improvements over time in more of a classical environment, then that would be a red flag. But that's why it's so important to have that defined, because if you don't have that defined, it's just a gray flag, like you don't know. Like, it could sound great, it depends how they verbalize it and communicate it to you, and it couldn't sound absolutely terrible, right? So yeah, it's so important to kind of have those two things kind of married together in that way. And I had a second point, and I can't remember what it was. But anything else on the top grading interview? So this one again is very much so diving deep into. Oh, that's what it was. When you're asking these questions, they're obviously they're in an interview. They're trying to impress you, right? They're going to highlight the good and diminish the bad. But the way you ask questions makes all the difference. So if you ask a question, and asking questions in this way has actually been studied. They've hooked people up to the brain signature reading, whatever they're called. EKGs, ECGs, I can't remember what they're called. One of those ones.
I think EKGs.
And they would be asked a question like, how do you think you did in doing this? How do you perceive your performance here? What do you think about how this scenario went? And they asked in that way, like, what do you think, and from your perspective? And then they asked the very similar questions in a little bit of a different way. If we were to ask your mother, what do you think she would say about this? If we were to ask your boss, what do you think they would say about your performance here? If we were to ask your coworker, what do you think they would say over here? It is so much easier. I'm going to say easier, but we're so much more honest in that if we ask a question that way and we don't even know it. Like it's just such a small, it's seemingly a small adjustment, but if you can find any ways to ask questions like that, like if we were to ask your direct report how this project that you feel that you surpassed expectations, what do you think that they would say? And then you hear them. I've done this before, and they're like, "Well, man, at the beginning of that, man, he wanted to like whoop my butt, man. The things were not going really great, but we pulled through in the end." It's like, okay, so you save things to the last minute, and then you come through like a hero at the end. It's like, you see, so it's a little bit of a different angle, and it helps get different perspectives rather than just being so, okay, well, how do you think you did? And then all they're thinking of is they crossed the finish line and they won. It's like, oh, we're great. So, Adriana, you look like you're chomping at the bit to say something.
I am. Yeah, that makes so much sense too, that you would get a completely different response, because when you flip the script on them and almost make them think of it outside of themselves, they're no longer focused on how they did and speaking from a personal sense of how they fulfilled on that thing. And when you take it out to the outside perspective, you're making them think about it from someone else's point of view. So now it doesn't feel as personal to them as it did, which is then when you're going to hear the truth about the situation most likely. So I think that that's such a great point, and something that I actually haven't heard talked about. Zach, I know you said that there's been studies on it, but I think bringing that into the interview process is going to be an absolute game changer to allow you to weed out and hear a different answer than you typically would from your candidate.
I think they started doing those studies with like not couples counseling, but relationship psychology. Like what would your wife say about this? And their answers changed drastically. But if you want to take it a step further, you add something at the end. Don't get started. You add something at the end of that question, which is when we call them, because you're going to be doing references at some point. So you could say, what do you feel like your direct report would say how you performed on this project? What do you think they would say when we call them? Like when we have that conversation, because they're going to be a reference, right? So then they're like, oh, well, that's just a little. And then actually do it. Actually do the reference calls. A lot of people skip out on the reference calls to actually do the reference, especially if it's like a key hire, any type of leadership, any type of role where you're hiring somebody to come in and have influence on your business, the processes, and the people. You need to be doing reference checks. Like that's a must, and not like, hey, do you like them? Cool. Like, no, dive in. Anything else to add to the top grading interview? Beautiful. What's next? Actually, what's next is the reference calls. But that's my favorite one, is the bullseye, the skill, will, and bullseye interview. This is my favorite one because this is where you get to have fun. And I would like to know, I don't know if you have any experience with these types of interviews, Chrissy, but they're one that I did is I had somebody who came in and they're on their, I think this was their third or fourth interview. We put them through the ringer, but they showed up to the office and I was like, hey, get in the truck. I have some errands to run. And we just drove around aimlessly. I didn't have any errands to run, and we just talked. And they're like, do you have any errands to run? He's like, no, I I forgot. I don't think I do today. Like, I think the dry cleaner's closed. I can't remember what I said. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. But he handled it really well. And we were able to have a conversation the whole time, right? And my truck was kind of dirty and whatever it is, and he handled it really well. Like, he was humble, he was down to earth. I was able to have a conversation with him. It's kind of like, what is your beer test? Like, some people refer to it as like, can you sit down and have a beer with them and converse and not feel uncomfortable? Can you push each other? Can you challenge each other? Do you show certain mannerisms that we would want in our business? I had a mentor who he would walk ahead. No, the candidate and his assistant would walk ahead. No, him and his assistant would walk ahead. There we go. Him and his assistant would walk ahead of them in a hallway, pretending to have a conversation. The assistant would drop a pen, and if he didn't immediately pick it up to hand it back to her, then that was like a red flag. He wouldn't. That was like a make or break kind of moment. But if that person didn't right away pick up the pen and didn't have to like stop and run back to pick up the pen. And another one is he would leave them alone with his assistant before their interview and see how he conversed with the assistant. And if he ignored her or didn't show her respect or didn't treat her well, then that was like a make or break. But he did a lot of these kind of things to like make sure they were a good fit. So do you have any experience with that? Is there anything that those kind of fun type of interviews, whether you've been on or you've done yourself?
I haven't really done that in a while. I think it's been hard. Number one, a lot of our interviews have been remote, and a lot of the people that I've hired have been in markets outside of where I'm based. So that is hard. So, I try to, when I'm hiring for my team, I try to make sure I can at least fly into the market and, spend some time with finalists or, at least the candidate that we want to make an offer to get them, out of the office or into the office in some cases, and just spend some time and see how they interact. But I've really been thinking a lot because we're doing so much networking, right? And a lot of the last couple layoffs around, in my industry, a lot of HR team members were impacted. And I've really been thinking about, how do I get back in front of some of my peer network groups? Because this is a great time where people have time to really start networking again. And, like, how do I want to have some of these beer test or like airport test moments with people now, when everyone has time to do it, almost as like who would I bring in for a screening interview, right? Like, I'm almost kind of thinking it around, how do I start building these screens or airport tests like before I even need to hire, so I can get like a much smaller list honed of like who is really on my target list for when I have the opportunity to bring someone in. It's much easier, right, to screen 10 people or 15 people rather than 100 people, right? Knowing and then just figuring out, okay, they like this person and I feel like we're vibing, like, so that's good because that relationship is really key. But also it will make a difference which of these 15 people are going to be able to thrive in the organization wherever we work together, right? And so that's really I've kind of been flipping the order in my own mind, you know what I mean, to kind of just get a running pipeline of people that I want to have in my network at all times.
Well, that's a great point, and you can do that, especially when it comes to like who you're letting in your network or inner circle, right? For businesses, I would suggest. I mean, you can do whatever you want. I mean, test and measure as long as it's consistent. Like, do what you want. Put this one at the beginning. One thing I would say is, if you want them to pass, or you have a beer test or airport test or drop a pen test, whatever it is, nice to the assistant test, and you do it at the beginning. Like, what if there's somebody that's nervous, or there's somebody that's a little bit. I mean, probably mostly that, like they're underperforming because they're nervous or something like that, as opposed to they've gone through a few interviews. that are more cyclical, and they're a little more warmed up, a little bit more excited about the opportunity. They've met a few people now. They're more likely to kind of more be themselves, and you have more ways to, okay, I'm going to test this person like this. Like they kind of seemed awkward here, so I'm gonna put my version of Donna. I always say, like, find yourself a Donna from Suits, somebody who like knows everything about you and your business and everything like that. But find your assistant or you're a manager or whoever, somebody you trust, and ask them some questions. Just go and sit with them and see what they do. They treat you well? One of the things that I had another mentor that did is he would take him for dinner, and if this individual, like especially if it was a male, if he looked, if he started oogling, a female waitress or whoever else in the restaurant and was really inappropriate with it when he was at dinner with his prospective boss, like that was like a no-go. Did he have manners? Did he order the most expensive thing on the menu? They had him pick the restaurant, and if they picked the most expensive restaurant, that means he didn't value the company's money right away. Therefore, that's a red flag, because a lot of these he was hiring for like salespeople who are going to be out on the road with company credit cards. So he needed to know that they would respect the company's dollar, at least at the beginning. So he would put them through these kind of tests. But he wouldn't have done that necessarily for his process, anyways. He wouldn't have done that at the beginning, because then that's way too many dinners. But he did it at the end when they've kind of got through. They know they've had.
Talking about before you even have a role to hire, like who do you want to?
Yeah,
you know what I'm
in
saying?
your network.
Like not before you start screening people for an open role, because this is a lot of time and money and investment. But yeah, like that's.
I think we should all have those kind of tests. Like is this somebody who I would want in my inner circle, my network, or was it somebody who would want to refer to somebody else, somebody who would want to have my name attached to? Like we all should have those types of processes, like our own, for that. Like, I don't know, whatever your dropping a pen test is. Or when we were talking about a few weeks ago, we were talking about bookstores in airports. Go see what kind of books they like. If they go right for the romance novels and skip through like the self-education, personal development, man, I don't know. I mean, it's up to you. Whatever, if you think that's a green flag or a red flag. Adrena would think that was a green flag. I would think it was a red flag. Chrissy, I don't know. You would probably be somewhere in the middle. I don't know. It's up to you, but it's yours, right? And be consistent with it. But so screening, top grading, and then some sort of skill, will, and bullseye, something fun, make it your own, something that tells you unequivocally if they could be, at least increases the chances that they would be a good fit for your company, for your team, for the initiatives that you have in place, and kind of where you're at in your company's growth and maturity, right? But have something like that and be consistent with it. Ideally, that, especially if you're a small business owner, small to medium-sized business owner, and it's a key player like manager or above, you should be the one to do that one at least. And then have a good team that sifts through the rest and does a good screening interview, consistent screening interview, good challenging top grading interview. That's one thing with the top grading interviews. Those should be 60, like those are longer interviews. Like those are 60 minute, sometimes 90-minute interviews. Because if they pass the screening interview, there's a good chance that they could be a good fit, if not now, sometime in the future. Somebody good to have in your network, like you said. And then, find something fun for the skills, wills, and bullseye. But then you have to offer them the job. And this is where I see a lot drop the ball. Is they get somebody who they think is perfect, and then they don't know, they go to offer them the job. They don't do any research into what the market average is. They don't do any research into what they actually, or they don't ask the questions, okay, what type of benefits do you see as, the most highly, like what would be the most beneficial to you as far as benefits? And some people would say, I want 401k and dental, like especially if they're older, they're going to be like, I want, my health insurance and that kind of stuff, which is fine, but that's typically what we think. But if you're hiring somebody younger, or somebody who is just an A player who wants to move up, is hungry to advance themselves, they might not see those as the most important benefits. They might see investing in education, giving opportunities, having them being pushed, and career development paths, whatever that looks like. So what are your thoughts around developing a good offer to increase the chances of you getting this person to accept?
Chrissy, take it away.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. First things first, I think you have to understand what's their motivation. So what Zach was saying, like what is a priority for them? So I would start by don't negotiate against yourself. Like let them speak, right? And so start off by asking them the questions. What is the biggest motivation for you to come to this organization? And what is the biggest motivation for you to stay with a company, right? And so those are the types of things you want to get them speaking. um, these days you have to pay, right? We talked about some of this in my podcast with Zach. Anyone can do payroll, right? Like it's just like, but what you're paying, why you're paying it, and how you want them to feel when they're collecting that check, like that is all about organizational like differentiation, right? And so that's really where you're going to want to put a lot of your offer is around like the value proposition. um, Pay transparency laws have become so mainstream, like even state to state, in the last 10 years. And so you can't really get around paying the candidate what their true value is in the marketplace. So that's something that you have to be able to do that research around. A lot of the job postings have to post the salary in California and New York. They post, the pay ranges for those types of roles. And there's sites like levels.fyi. There's apps like Blind where people are sharing out what their total comp looks like. Now, these are all user generated, so it could be total bullshit, but like you should know what's out there because that's the frame of reference for that employee or that candidate. And um, so that's another piece is like you should have some of your own research done, like Glassdoor, things of that nature. Like, what are the sources of information where these candidates are going to get details on what they think their offer should be? And you have to be true to your budget. Don't, bankrupt yourself in order to get this top talent. Like, when you go through the process of sourcing candidates and writing job descriptions and screening tens of candidates, and you get through these 50 hours of interviews after you go through all the panels and you do the bullseye test and you find your bullseye and you're like, this is our hire, you're going to want to close this candidate. And so I think that one, don't lose control, right? By like trying to close this candidate for all intents and purposes. And second, try to have a runner up because even if you love this person and you think they're the perfect match, something you can't control that other person, and it is a negotiation. So that person's always, as much of a good honest relationship you think you have in that moment, they're always going to keep some information up their sleeve. And so what they might not be telling you could be like a non-negotiable for you and your company, and you may have to walk away, right? And so I would always have a second runner up that you feel great about, because it's much easier to let a candidate go when you have another candidate that you would feel just as excited about if you had to make that offer to them. So I think that's kind of how I would think about the offer stage, and making sure that you're really able to keep some rigor and put something together that really feels like it's going to resonate with the right person.
No, that's a great point. Having the second to have a runner up, absolutely. It's also there's kind of like a false mindset that I think a lot of especially small business owners that haven't had to hire a ton of key players have, and then they're starting to compete in their marketplace with talent over talent. Is they'll think, well, they made it this far. They went through 4 interviews or whatever it is, whatever your process is. They definitely want the job, so they'll probably take whatever we give them. I have this weird mindset, but they could have 2 other offers on the table. They could be just using your offer as leverage to get a better offer at another job. You don't know, right? And ideally, you've created a good relationship with them so that they will be honest with you, but sometimes they won't be. I mean, and you can't blame them. They're looking out for themselves. They have to, right? Especially if they have a family and that kind of thing. They're going to do what's best for them. But yet, don't go into it with the naivety of, well, they went through a bunch of interviews. This is a great opportunity. Everyone thinks their opportunity is the greatest opportunity. Like, you don't know. They could have other offers. They could have somebody who just, like another recruiter who just reached out to them for a great opportunity. Like they don't going into it with like they need us more than we need them is like just set up for it's a setup for disaster, for a failure. But you don't do that, still have that second person, because even if you do everything right, they could not work out. One of our other clients, they hired somebody. We thought that he was going to be incredible, an IT director. He ended up leaving for a better opportunity 2 months in, and they didn't have anybody on deck to come back in. And again, the naivety that you're offered, or that your opportunity is the best opportunity or the only opportunity, is that could be a big downfall. Anything else to add for offer? The offer stage? No? So we go much more in depth in this framework. Obviously, it's part of a much bigger framework, which is increasing your talent density, where we go into even how to fire people, which we kind of alluded to today. When's the right time to fire them or let them go? Firing's a little bit harsh. To let them go and help them move on to other opportunities. Ideally, that's the case. How do you develop them when they come in? How do you do PIP plans, performance improvement plans, running meetings, creating career paths? That's all part of a bigger framework. But again, it's a part of the foundations of your business. It's business foundations, and that's what we do. It's something that's always going to be prevalent and very important, is getting the right people on your team. We go back to the sports analogy. You could have the coolest stadium. You could have the best cameras. You could have the most well-known, highest paid coach. But if you don't have the right players on your team that are bought into their role, that are bought into accomplishing the mission and doing it for the betterment of the team, it's just not going to work out. You could have the best CRM, best software. You could have 3 different AI chatbots doing your work. But if you don't have the right people to manage it, the right people to front it, the right people to sell it, engage with your community, engage with your prospects, engage with your market, it's just not going to go anywhere. So this is the foundations, and it's so important, and it's so reactive in a lot of cases because it's just not seen as important. Like we talked about, finding the avatar, defining who's going to be successful in this role, where a lot of times it's like, oh crap, we need somebody in this role. Throw it a description from ChatGPT, throw it a description. Okay, this person managed a bunch of people. He sounded good. He passed a 5-minute beer test. Hire him. You do that enough, the first one might not burn you too bad. The second one, third one, fifth one, you're getting into trouble. You're starting to lose the culture. You're starting to lose the purpose that you started with if you keep being reactive with this. So set yourself up with a good talent acquisition process. Stick to it. If you need help, we're here. But I want to end this with Chrissy. Chrissy, every week we highlight a small business of the week. You always wear their gear, which is incredibly impressive. So Chrissy, take it away. Who's the small business of the week?
Great. I want to shout out Bungalow Bar in Rockaway Beach. We do love to have the swag of all the businesses that we love and support, and Bungalow is such a staple of here in Rockaway Beach. And then also they have a series of restaurants and bars in the city, in New York City. And then also I think they're actually expanding some to Florida. So they're probably going to be in a neighborhood near you soon. This is a family built business. They have really just every location you go to, it's not all bungalows. There's different restaurants. But the company is called In Good Company, and they just are excellent. Awesome food, awesome atmosphere, awesome party environments. It's just like your awesome comfort environment. So just like your staple go-to place that just feels like it's guaranteed 10 out of 10 every time you go. So I just want to shout them out and thank you for all they're doing to employ and, bring people together and invest in the community. And they really pulled it out after Hurricane Sandy and had to rebuild their entire bar here at Rockaway. And they're just such a pillar of the community. And I think just a staple of what small businesses do for the towns and cities that they're in.
Beautiful. And we will link them down below. Go check them out if you're in the area. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. We can't wait to do more of these. We hope you got a lot out of this one. Again, if you want to learn more about the Increasing Your Talent Density Framework, I'll leave a description in below. We can book a call, chat with us, no obligation. We'll just see what's going on, what you have going on, where you want to be, and we'll help you out as much as we can. But until next time, everybody, keep chasing your next summit.